In the vast mythology of ancient Greece, no god has been more misunderstood than Hades. For centuries, storytellers, artists, and filmmakers have painted him as a villain, a dark figure lurking in the shadows, plotting against the gods of Olympus, ruling his kingdom with cruelty and malice. But the ancient Greeks themselves saw something entirely different. To them, Hades was not evil. He was inevitable. Hades was the god of the underworld, yes. But more than that, he was the god of what comes after, of endings, of the quiet, unavoidable truth that every mortal life must one day reach its final chapter. And in a world ruled by gods of thunder, war, love, and wisdom, it was Hades who carried perhaps the heaviest burden of all, the responsibility of the dead. Unlike his brother Zeus, who ruled the sky with lightning and spectacle, or Poseidon, who commanded the seas with fury and unpredictability, Hades ruled from beneath the earth, unseen, unheard, rarely worshipped in temples above ground. The Greeks rarely built grand shrines to him, not because they hated him, but because they feared even speaking his name might draw his attention. In fact, many Greeks avoided saying Hades directly, instead calling him Plauton, meaning the rich one, a reference to the precious metals and fertile soil hidden beneath the earth, which were also his domain. This is the first clue to who Hades truly was, a god of paradox, the lord of death, yet also a god of wealth and hidden abundance, feared, yet strangely just, cold, yet, as we'll see later in this story, capable of a devotion so deep it would reshape the seasons of the earth itself. Physically, the Greeks imagined Hades as a stern, bearded figure, often seated upon a dark throne, holding a scepter or a key, the key to the gates of the underworld, which he alone possessed. He was rarely depicted in violent poses, unlike Ares or Zeus. Instead, artists showed him seated, still, watching, a god who did not need to fight to command respect. His power was not in domination, but in permanence. Everyone, eventually, came to him. But how did Hades come to rule the realm of the dead? To understand that, we have to go back before Olympus, before the golden age of the gods we know today, to a war that shook the very foundations of the cosmos, the war against the Titans, and the moment three brothers divided the universe between them. To understand Hades, we must go back to the very beginning of Greek mythology, to a time before Olympus existed, before there were 12 gods ruling from golden thrones. In this time, the universe was governed not by Zeus, Hera, or Poseidon, but by an older, darker generation of divine beings, the Titans. At the head of the Titans stood Cronus, a god consumed by fear. Long ago, it had been prophesied that one of his own children would rise up and overthrow him, just as he himself had once overthrown his own father, Uranus. Determined to prevent this fate, Cronus made a horrifying decision. As each of his children was born, he swallowed them whole. Hades was the first of these children. Born to Cronus and his wife Rhea, Hades entered the world only to be immediately consumed by his own father, trapped alive in the darkness of Cronus's stomach. He was followed by his siblings, Hestia, Demeter, Hera, and Poseidon. Each one swallowed the moment they were born. 5 children, swallowed whole, imprisoned within their own father, waiting in darkness for a freedom they could not yet imagine. Only the 6th child escaped this fate. When Zeus was born, Rhea, desperate to save at least one of her children, deceived Cronus by wrapping a stone in swaddling clothes and presenting it to him instead. Cronus, without a second thought, swallowed the stone, believing he had consumed his final threat. Zeus was secretly taken away to be raised in hiding, far from his father's reach, on the island of Crete. Years passed. Zeus grew into adulthood, hidden from the world, learning of his true destiny. And when the time was right, he returned, not as a helpless infant, but as a god ready to challenge his father directly. Using cunning rather than force, Zeus tricked Cronus into drinking a potion that caused him to vomit up everything he had swallowed. One by one, Hades and his siblings were released, reborn, in a sense, after years trapped in darkness. It's worth pausing here on this detail. Hades, the future god of death and the underworld, began his own existence trapped in a kind of living tomb, only to be reborn into the light. Even from birth, his story was intertwined with themes of entrapment, darkness, and release. Freed at last, Hades and his siblings joined Zeus in a war that would reshape the universe, the Titanomachy, the great war between the Olympian gods and the Titans. This was not a brief skirmish. According to ancient sources, this war raged for 10 long years, shaking the earth, the seas, and the heavens themselves. Hades played a crucial, though often overlooked, role in this war. When the three brothers, Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades, descended to free the Cyclopes, powerful one-eyed craftsmen imprisoned by Cronus, the Cyclopes rewarded them with extraordinary gifts. Zeus received the thunderbolt, the weapon that would define his reign. Poseidon received the trident, granting him mastery over the seas. And Hades received something quieter, but no less powerful, the Helm of Darkness, a helmet that granted its wearer complete invisibility. With this gift, Hades became a silent, unseen weapon of war. While Zeus hurled lightning from the skies and Poseidon shook the earth with his trident, Hades moved unseen among the Titans, striking without warning, sabotaging their weapons, and vanishing before retaliation could come. It was a fitting foreshadowing of the god he would become, not a being of spectacle and noise, but of quiet, inevitable presence. After 10 grueling years, the Olympians finally triumphed. The Titans were defeated and cast down into Tartarus, the deepest and darkest pit of the underworld, a prison even lower than the realm Hades himself would soon rule. The age of the Titans had ended. The age of the Olympians had begun. But now came a new question, one that would determine the fate of the entire cosmos. How would the three brothers divide their newfound power? With the Titans defeated and cast into the depths of Tartarus, the three brothers, Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades, stood victorious over a universe now theirs to command. But victory brought a new challenge. The old order had been destroyed. Someone now had to decide who would rule what remained. According to the most widely told version of the myth, the three brothers settled this question not through conflict, but through chance. They drew lots, a divine lottery to determine the domains of creation. Zeus drew the sky, becoming ruler of the heavens, the clouds, the storms, and by extension, king over gods and mortals alike. Poseidon drew the sea, gaining dominion over the oceans, the tides, and every creature that swam beneath the waves. And Hades drew the third and final realm, the underworld, the kingdom of the dead. It's important to pause here and correct a common misconception. Many assume Hades was somehow cheated, given the worst domain out of spite or punishment. But in the original Greek understanding, this wasn't a punishment at all. It was simply how the universe needed to be balanced. Every realm required a ruler. The sky needed Zeus. The sea needed Poseidon. And the vast, ever-growing kingdom of the dead needed someone equally powerful to govern it. someone who could maintain order among the countless souls that would come to reside there for eternity. In a sense, Hades' role was the most demanding of the three. Zeus and Poseidon ruled over the living world, a world that renewed itself endlessly. New storms, new tides, new seasons. Hades, meanwhile, ruled a kingdom that only grew. Every mortal who had ever lived, or who ever would live, was destined to eventually stand before him. His subjects were infinite, and his kingdom, unlike the others, held no room for excess or celebration, only permanence. Unlike Zeus and Poseidon, Hades rarely left his domain. While his brothers frequently traveled to Olympus, attended feasts, involved themselves in the affairs of mortals, and appeared throughout countless myths meddling in human lives, Hades remained almost entirely absent from the world above. This absence wasn't due to exile or resentment. It was devotion to duty. Someone had to remain and maintain balance in the underworld, and Hades took this responsibility with a seriousness none of the other gods shared. This is why, unlike Zeus, Hades has remarkably few myths involving affairs, conflicts, or petty rivalries. He is rarely depicted starting wars or manipulating mortals for personal gain. His myths, when they do appear, tend to be about boundaries, about what happens when someone tries to cross into his realm, or when he himself dares to cross into the world above, as we will soon see in the story of Persephone. With his domain established, Hades descended into the underworld to take his throne, a place that was not simply one realm, but an entire world unto itself, filled with rivers, gates, guardians, and regions unlike anything in the world above. And to truly understand Hades, we must now journey into that world ourselves, through the gates, past the guardians, and into the very geography of the land of the dead. To understand Hades' kingdom, we must abandon any modern notion of the underworld as a place of fire and eternal torment. In Greek mythology, the underworld, often simply called Hades after its ruler, was not a single realm of punishment, but an entire world beneath the world, complete with rivers, gates, guardians, judges, and regions as varied and complex as anything found on the surface above. The journey into this world began, for every soul, at the edge of 5 great rivers that divided the realm of the living from the realm of the dead. The most famous of these was the river Styx, the river of hatred, and the most sacred of all waters, so powerful that even the gods swore their most binding oaths upon its name. To break a promise sworn on the Styx was considered one of the gravest transgressions a god could commit. Alongside the Styx flowed the Acheron, the river of woe, often described as the primary river souls crossed to enter the underworld. Then came the Cocytus, the river of wailing, said to be formed from the tears of those condemned. The Phlegethon burned instead of flowing, a river of fire associated with rage and punishment. And finally, the Lethe, perhaps the most haunting of all, the river of forgetfulness. Souls who drank from its waters, or in some versions bathed within it, lost all memory of their former lives, a merciful erasure for some, a tragic loss for others. At the banks of these rivers waited one of the underworld's most iconic figures, Charon, the ferryman of the dead. An old, gaunt figure, wrapped in tattered robes, Charon carried souls across the waters into the underworld proper, but not for free. Ancient Greek burial customs required a coin, usually an obol, to be placed in or on the mouth of the deceased, payment for Charon's passage. Those who could not pay, the unburied, the forgotten, the abandoned, were doomed to wander the shores for 100 years, neither dead nor truly at rest, trapped in the space between worlds. Beyond the rivers stood the gates of the underworld itself, guarded by a creature whose name has echoed through mythology for thousands of years. Cerberus, the three-headed hound. Cerberus was not merely a guard dog. He was a monstrous hybrid, often depicted with a mane of writhing serpents and a tail ending in a serpent's head of its own. His task was singular and absolute, to ensure that the dead could enter, but never leave. He welcomed souls in with terrifying calm, yet turned into an unstoppable force of violence against any soul, or any living being, foolish enough to attempt escape. Once past Charon and Cerberus, souls arrived before 3 judges, Minos, Rhadamanthus, and Iacchus, once mortal kings, chosen after death for their wisdom and fairness, now tasked with judging the deeds of every soul that passed before them. Based on their judgment, a soul would be sent to one of 3 very different regions. The first, and most common destination, was the Asphodel Fields, a vast gray twilight meadow where the majority of ordinary souls resided. This was not a place of punishment, nor of reward, but of quiet neutrality. A dim, shadowy existence for those who had lived lives neither remarkably virtuous nor remarkably wicked. For those judged truly wicked, there was Tartarus, not simply part of the underworld, but a prison so deep that, according to Hesiod, an anvil dropped from the surface would fall for 9 days before reaching it. This was the same abyss where the defeated Titans had been cast after their war with the Olympians. Here, legendary sinners endured eternal punishment. Sisyphus, forever pushing his boulder up a hill only to watch it roll back down. Tantalus, forever reaching for fruit and water that eternally escaped his grasp. And for the truly virtuous, heroes, the righteous, and those favored by the gods, there existed the Elysian Fields, a paradise of eternal spring, peace, and happiness, reserved for the most blessed souls. This, then, was the world Hades ruled, not a single dark cavern, but an entire cosmos of rivers, judgment, punishment, and peace. A kingdom as vast and complex as the world of the living above it. But no story of Hades's realm is complete without the myth that changed everything. The story of how the god of the dead fell in love and reshaped the very seasons of the earth in doing so. The myth of Persephone. Of all the stories connected to Hades, none is more famous, or more consequential, than the myth of Persephone. It is a story of love, loss, defiance, and negotiation between gods, and it remains, to this day, the ancient Greek explanation for one of nature's greatest mysteries, the changing of the seasons. Persephone was the daughter of Demeter, goddess of the harvest, agriculture, and the fertility of the earth. Where Hades ruled the world beneath, Demeter ruled the abundance of the world above, the wheat fields, the orchards, the cycles of planting and growth that sustained all mortal life. Persephone, her only daughter, was said to embody youth and springtime itself, bright, gentle, and deeply loved by her mother, who kept her close, often shielding her from the wider world of gods and their schemes. One day, while gathering flowers in a meadow with a group of nymphs, Persephone noticed something unusual. A flower unlike any she had seen before. In some versions, a narcissus, extraordinarily beautiful and strangely out of place. As she reached to pick it, the earth beneath her suddenly split open. From the depths below, Hades emerged in his chariot, drawn by immortal black horses, and in an instant seized Persephone and pulled her down into the earth. The ground closed above them as quickly as it had opened, sealing away any trace of what had happened. It's worth noting here that in most ancient sources, this abduction was not simply an act of random cruelty. Many versions suggest Zeus himself had secretly approved the union beforehand, promising Persephone to his brother without informing Demeter. This detail matters because it reveals something important about how the ancient Greeks understood this myth. It wasn't just a story about a kidnapping. It was a story about power, about the different kinds of consent and control that existed between gods, and about a mother's grief colliding with decisions made far above her authority. Demeter searched for her daughter relentlessly. For 9 days and 9 nights, she wandered the earth without rest, without food, carrying 2 torches to light her way through the darkness, calling out Persephone's name to every corner of the world. No god would answer her. No mortal had witnessed the abduction. Finally, it was Hecate, goddess of magic and crossroads, who came to Demeter and revealed that she had heard Persephone's cries, though she had not seen who had taken her. Together, Demeter and Hecate went to Helios, the sun god, who saw all things from his position in the sky. Helios, reluctant but unable to deny the truth, revealed everything. Hades had taken Persephone into the underworld to be his queen, and Zeus himself had allowed it. Demeter's grief transformed into fury. In her devastation and rage, she abandoned her divine duties entirely. She withdrew from Olympus and refused to allow anything to grow on earth. Crops withered. Fields turned barren. Famine spread across the world of mortals, threatening not just human life, but the very sacrifices and offerings that sustained the gods themselves. For the first time, the divine order faced a crisis it could not ignore. A goddess's grief was on the verge of destroying the world. Zeus, watching mortals starve and realizing the severity of what his decision had caused, was finally forced to intervene. He sent the messenger god Hermes down into the underworld with a command. Hades must release Persephone and return her to her mother. Hades, upon receiving Zeus's command, did not resist or defy his brother. But before allowing Persephone to leave, he offered her a pomegranate, and in some versions gently encouraged her to eat from it before her departure. Persephone ate a small number of the seeds. Some say 3, others say 4 or 6, depending on the version of the myth. This single act would change everything. According to the ancient laws governing the underworld, any being who consumed food grown within its boundaries became bound to that realm forever. By eating even a few pomegranate seeds, Persephone had unknowingly tied herself permanently to Hades' kingdom. When this was revealed, a new negotiation had to take place, one that would ultimately determine the fate of the natural world for all of eternity. It was decided, through the intervention of Zeus, that Persephone would spend part of the year in the underworld with Hades, and the remainder of the year above ground with her mother. The exact division varies by source. Some say 4 months below, others say 6. But the outcome remained the same. For part of the year, Persephone would return to Demeter, and the earth would flourish once again, bringing spring and summer. But when Persephone descended once more into the underworld to be with Hades, Demeter's grief would return, and with it, the barren months of autumn and winter. This is, at its heart, the ancient Greek explanation for the seasons themselves, not as random natural cycles, but as the physical manifestation of a mother's love and grief, repeating endlessly across time. But there's a deeper layer to this myth that often goes unexamined, one that concerns not Demeter, not Zeus, but Persephone and Hades themselves, and the relationship they built within the underworld over the following centuries of myth. Contrary to popular modern retellings that frame Hades purely as a captor and Persephone purely as a victim for eternity, many ancient sources, particularly from later Greek religious practice, depict Persephone not as a prisoner, but as a powerful queen in her own right. She is frequently shown seated beside Hades on her own throne, issuing judgments alongside him, and even showing mercy or cruelty towards souls entirely on her own authority. In several myths, it is Persephone, not Hades, who decides the fate of certain souls that enter the underworld, including the tragic tale of Orpheus, which we will explore shortly. Ancient religious cults, particularly the Eleusinian mysteries, one of the most important religious traditions in all of ancient Greece, worshipped Persephone not as a victim, but as a goddess of transformation, a figure who had crossed between the world of the living and the world of the dead, and returned each year with the secrets of both. To the initiates of these mysteries, Persephone represented hope, proof that even after descending into darkness, return and renewal were possible. In this light, the myth of Persephone is not simply a story about an abduction. It is the origin story of the underworld's queen, a goddess who began as a symbol of spring and became, through her journey into darkness, a ruler equally at home among the dead as she once was among the living flowers of the world above. And it was alongside this queen that Hades would preside over some of the most tragic and unforgettable stories in Greek mythology, including the tale of a mortal musician whose love was so powerful it nearly convinced the god of death himself to break the one law he never broke. Among all the mortals who ever dared to cross into Hades's domain, none is remembered with more sorrow or more reverence than Orpheus, a name that, even thousands of years later, remains synonymous with the power of music, love, and the tragedy of what happens when even that power is not quite enough. Orpheus was not an ordinary mortal. According to most traditions, he was the son of Calliope, the muse of epic poetry, and in some versions, Apollo himself was said to be his father or divine patron. From this lineage, Orpheus inherited a gift unlike any other musician before or since. When he played his lyre and sang, the effect on the world around him was nothing short of miraculous. Wild beasts would lay down beside him, calmed. Trees were said to uproot themselves and lean toward his voice. Rivers paused their flow. Even the gods, when he played among them, would stop to listen. His music was not simply beautiful. It was described as a force capable of bending the natural world to its will. Orpheus fell deeply in love with a woman named Eurydice, a nymph or, in some tellings, a mortal woman of extraordinary grace. Their love was said to be immediate and profound, and the two were soon married. But their happiness was devastatingly brief. Shortly after their wedding, while walking through a meadow, Eurydice was bitten by a venomous snake hidden in the grass. In some versions of the myth, she had been fleeing the unwanted advances of another god or shepherd when the snake struck. Within moments, she collapsed and died, her soul descending immediately into the underworld to take her place among the countless dead who had come before her. Orpheus was consumed by a grief unlike anything he had experienced. Unwilling, perhaps unable, to accept the permanence of her death, he made a decision no mortal before him had dared to make. He would journey into the underworld himself, alive, and demand her return. This alone made Orpheus extraordinary. The underworld was not a place the living were meant to enter. Its gates, its guardians, its very laws existed specifically to prevent exactly what Orpheus intended to do. And yet, armed with nothing but his lyre, he descended. At the banks of the river Styx, Charon the ferryman, who never carried the living, only the souls of the dead, was so moved by the sorrow and beauty of Orpheus's music that he broke his own ancient rule and rowed him across. At the gates, Cerberus, the three-headed hound who had never once allowed passage to any living being, was lulled into a docile calm by the same music, allowing Orpheus to pass unharmed. Deeper still, Orpheus encountered the very souls suffering eternal punishment in Tartarus. It said that even they paused their torment while he played. Sisyphus, for the briefest moment, stopped pushing his boulder. Tantalus, reaching endlessly for fruit that always escaped him, momentarily forgot his hunger. The power of Orpheus's grief, transformed into music, was strong enough to interrupt punishments the gods themselves had declared eternal and absolute. Finally, Orpheus arrived before the thrones of Hades and Persephone. He did not come with demands or threats. He came with music, and through it, with a plea so raw and sorrowful that it accomplished what no mortal ever had. It moved the god of death himself. According to the most famous telling of the myth, Orpheus sang not just of his love for Eurydice, but of the universal truth that awaited every soul in that room, that all things, eventually, belonged to Hades. He argued that Eurydice's death had come too soon, her thread of life cut short before its natural time, and he begged not to steal her from death entirely, but simply to borrow her back, to allow her the years she was owed among the living before returning, as all mortals eventually must, to Hades's kingdom. It said that as he sang, even the Furies, the terrifying goddesses of vengeance, beings who were said to never weep, were moved to tears for the first time in their existence. Persephone, herself once taken from the world above against her will, was said to be especially moved by his plea, and it was she who urged Hades to grant his request. Hades agreed, but not without conditions. Eurydice's soul would be allowed to follow Orpheus back to the world of the living, but under one absolute rule. Orpheus must walk ahead of her the entire journey out of the underworld, and under no circumstances could he turn to look back at her until they had both fully returned to the surface world. If he broke this single rule, even for a moment, Eurydice would be lost to the underworld forever. Orpheus agreed without hesitation, and the journey began. Through the shadowed halls of the underworld, past Cerberus, past the banks of the Styx, Orpheus walked forward, guided only by faith that Eurydice's footsteps followed behind him. He could not hear her breathing. He could not hear her voice. In the silence and darkness of the underworld, he had only Hades's word that she was truly there. As he approached the very edge of the underworld, where darkness finally gave way to daylight, doubt overcame him. Some versions say he heard a sound behind him and feared she had stumbled. Others suggest simple, human desperation, an overwhelming need to confirm after everything that she was truly following him home. Just as he stepped into the light of the world above, Orpheus turned to look back. Eurydice, still shrouded in the shadow of the underworld, had not yet crossed the threshold. In that single instant, her form dissolved back into mist, and she was pulled back into the depths of Hades's realm, this time forever. Orpheus reached out, desperate, but his hands closed around nothing but air. He heard only a single, final word from her, whispered as she was pulled away. Farewell. Orpheus attempted to follow her back into the underworld, but this time Charon refused him passage. The rules had been broken, and the underworld's mercy, once granted, would not be given a second time. What makes this myth so enduring, so quoted, retold, and reimagined across thousands of years of art, opera, and literature, is not simply its tragedy, but what it reveals about Hades himself. Here was the god most feared by mortals, the ruler of the dead, the one being in the universe who never negotiated the fate of souls. And yet, for a single moment, moved by music and grief, he broke his own absolute law. It is one of the only myths in which Hades's character reveals something beyond duty and permanence, a capacity, however brief, for mercy. Orpheus, heartbroken beyond recovery, spent the rest of his life wandering the earth, refusing all other love, playing songs of sorrow until his own tragic death. But that is a story for another time. For now, his myth leaves us with a haunting truth about the underworld. Even the god of the dead, the most unyielding force in the Greek cosmos, could be moved, if only for a moment, and only through the extraordinary act of a man refusing to accept that love could truly end at the threshold of death. Deep within Tartarus, far below the fields where ordinary souls wandered in quiet neutrality, Hades presided over punishments reserved for those who had committed the gravest offenses, not against mortals, but against the gods themselves. Among these condemned souls, two names have echoed through history as the ultimate symbols of futility and torment: Sisyphus and Tantalus. Sisyphus was, during his life, the king of Corinth, a mortal renowned not for strength or virtue, but for his extraordinary cunning. In fact, it was precisely this cunning that led to his downfall. According to the most famous version of his myth, Sisyphus had the audacity to cheat death itself, not once, but twice. The first time, Sisyphus witnessed Zeus abducting the river nymph Aegina and, in exchange for a favor, revealed the god's secret to her father. Enraged, Zeus sent Thanatos, the personification of death, to chain Sisyphus and drag him to the underworld. But Sisyphus, ever clever, tricked Thanatos into demonstrating how the chains worked, and then promptly chained Death himself. With Thanatos imprisoned, no mortal anywhere in the world could die, throwing the natural order into chaos until Ares, god of war, furious that battles no longer produced casualties, freed Thanatos and forced Sisyphus to finally face his fate. Even then, Sisyphus wasn't finished. Before dying, he instructed his wife not to perform the proper burial rites. When he arrived in the underworld, he complained to Persephone that he had been improperly buried and convinced her to let him return briefly to the world above to arrange his own funeral rites and punish his wife for her disobedience. Once free, of course, Sisyphus had no intention of returning. He lived out many more years before finally being dragged back to the underworld by force. For these repeated acts of deception against death itself, Hades devised a punishment that would become one of the most famous images in all of mythology. Sisyphus was condemned to push an enormous boulder up a steep hill. But just as he neared the top, exhausting every bit of his strength, the boulder would slip from his grasp and roll back down to the bottom, forcing him to begin again. And again. Forever. The punishment wasn't simply physical labor, it was the eternal denial of completion itself. Sisyphus, a man who had always found a clever way out of every trap, was condemned to a task with no possible end, no victory, no escape through cunning. It was, in a sense, the perfect punishment, an eternity spent doing the one thing his cleverness could never solve. Tantalus, meanwhile, faced a punishment born from an entirely different kind of transgression. Tantalus was a mortal king, and remarkably, a son of Zeus himself, a status that granted him rare privileges, including invitations to dine among the gods on Olympus. But Tantalus abused this trust in one of the most shocking ways recorded in Greek mythology. In the most disturbing version of his myth, Tantalus decided to test whether the gods were truly omniscient. He killed his own son, Pelops, cooked his flesh, and served it to the gods at a banquet, hoping to see if they would notice. Every god immediately recognized the horror before them and refused to eat, except Demeter, who, consumed by her grief over the loss of Persephone at the time, absent-mindedly ate a portion of the shoulder before realizing the truth. The gods, horrified, restored Pelops to life, replacing his missing shoulder with one made of ivory. For this unspeakable act, Hades condemned Tantalus to a punishment that has since given the English language its own word: tantalize. Tantalus was placed in a pool of water beneath a tree heavy with ripe fruit hanging just above his head. Whenever he reached up to grasp the fruit, the branches would rise just out of reach. Whenever he bent down to drink from the pool to quench his burning thirst, the water would recede before it touched his lips. Eternally surrounded by nourishment, Tantalus was condemned to eternal hunger and thirst, an endless, agonizing nearness to relief that would never come. Together, Sisyphus and Tantalus represent something essential about how Hades governed his realm. His punishments were rarely about physical pain alone. They were profoundly psychological, engineered to mirror the exact nature of each soul's transgression. Sisyphus, who cheated the natural order through cunning, was denied any possibility of a clever solution. Tantalus, who betrayed the trust of the gods by offering them something monstrous disguised as nourishment, was condemned to be surrounded by nourishment he could never touch. This reveals something important about Hades as a ruler. He was not simply cruel for the sake of cruelty. His justice, however severe, carried a strange and deliberate symmetry. A reflection, many scholars argue, of the Greek belief that true punishment wasn't found in random suffering, but in facing, for eternity, the exact shape of one's own crime. Of all the mortals who ever entered Hades's domain, only one did so not through trickery, not through the power of music, and not through death itself, but through sheer, overwhelming strength, sanctioned by the gods as the final and most impossible trial of his life. This was Heracles, and his encounter with Hades would become known as the 12th and final of his legendary labors. By this point in his story, Heracles had already accomplished feats that should have been impossible for any mortal, slaying the Nemean lion with his bare hands, defeating the many-headed Hydra, capturing the golden hind of Artemis, and cleaning the entire Augean stables in a single day by redirecting 2 rivers. Each labor had been assigned to him by King Eurystheus as punishment, a penance demanded by the gods after Heracles, driven mad by Hera's curse, had committed an unspeakable tragedy against his own family. But nothing Heracles had faced before compared to what awaited him in his final task. He was ordered to descend into the underworld itself, alive, and bring back Cerberus, the monstrous 3-headed hound who guarded Hades's gates and had never once, in the entirety of his existence, allowed a living being to pass in either direction. Unlike Orpheus, who approached the underworld through sorrow and music, Heracles approached it as he approached everything, directly and through strength. Before descending, he was initiated into the Eleusinian mysteries, the same sacred rites associated with Persephone's return each spring, which were said to prepare mortals for a safe journey into the realm of the dead. With this protection, and guided by Hermes and Athena, Heracles descended into the underworld through a cave entrance at Tainaron, one of the mythological gateways between the world of the living and the dead. Once inside, Heracles encountered many of the underworld's most feared inhabitants. He faced the Gorgon Medusa's spirit, though it could not truly harm him in this realm. He freed Theseus, a fellow hero who had been trapped in the underworld after a failed attempt to abduct Persephone years earlier, chained to a rock as eternal punishment. In some versions, Heracles even wrestled with Hades' own herdsman, Meneuates, in a rare act of underworld violence, only stopping when Persephone herself intervened and asked him to show mercy. Finally, Heracles stood before Hades and Persephone themselves, and in a moment that reveals much about how the ancient Greeks understood Hades' character, Heracles did not attempt to steal Cerberus by force or deception. Instead, he asked permission. Hades, unlike nearly every other god in Greek mythology, when confronted by a hero seeking to take something from their domain, agreed. But true to his nature as a god of absolute and unbending rules, he set one condition. Heracles could take Cerberus, but only if he could subdue the beast using nothing but his own bare hands, without weapons of any kind. This single condition tells us something important about Hades as a ruler. He was not interested in preventing Heracles through cruelty or spite. He simply required that if the natural order of his kingdom were to be disturbed, even briefly, it must be done through a trial worthy of disturbing it, a test of pure strength and will, not weaponry or trickery. Heracles accepted. Approaching Cerberus, protected by nothing but a lion's skin draped over his shoulders, the pelt of the Nemean lion from his very first labor, Heracles grappled with the three-headed hound in a struggle that ancient sources describe as one of his most physically brutal encounters. Cerberus's serpent tail struck at him repeatedly, and each of Cerberus's three heads fought independently, snapping and lunging. But eventually, through sheer, relentless strength, Heracles subdued the beast, wrapping his arms around its neck until it yielded. Heracles carried Cerberus out of the underworld and into the world above, presenting the monstrous hound before King Eurystheus, who, according to legend, was so utterly terrified at the sight of the creature that he hid inside a large storage jar and begged Heracles to immediately return the beast to where it belonged. Heracles obliged, carrying Cerberus safely back to the underworld, where the hound resumed his eternal post at the gates, undisturbed by the brief and unprecedented interruption to his duty. What makes this myth so significant isn't merely the display of Heracles' strength. It's what it reveals about Hades' character once again. Even when confronted by a mortal with the audacity to demand something no other being had ever successfully taken from his kingdom, Hades did not react with the fury or cruelty audiences might expect from the villain of popular imagination. Instead, he responded exactly as he had with Orpheus, with fairness, with rules, and with a strange, quiet respect. For effort and worthiness, so long as the fundamental order of his realm remained ultimately intact. Cerberus returned to his post. The gates remained sealed once more, and Hades' kingdom, disturbed only briefly by the will of a hero and the desperation of a grieving husband, returned to the silence and permanence that had defined it since the very beginning of the world. So who is Hades, really? Not the villain of modern retellings, but the god the ancient Greeks actually believed in and quietly respected. Across every myth we've explored, one thing stays consistent: fairness. Hades didn't start wars like Zeus or lash out in rage like Poseidon. When Orpheus came pleading with grief, or Heracles came demanding Cerberus, Hades responded not with cruelty, but with rules, and, on rare occasions, mercy. Perhaps that's why he's endured for thousands of years. Not because he was frightening, but because he represented something every civilization has had to accept: the certainty of endings. Every mortal understood they would one day meet him, not as a villain, but as the quiet keeper of what comes next. In a world of gods defined by spectacle, Hades ruled through something quieter: permanence. He sought no glory, no throne beyond the one he was given. And in that permanence, the Greeks found not a monster, but a truth to accept. Thank you for journeying through the underworld with us. If this resonated, subscribe. Next, we descend into an entirely different mythology.